Yes. Hello, everyone. This is a rather big panel discussion that we're having. My name is Jakob Ulmer. I'm part of the Digital Communication Methods Lab, and I'm co-chairing this panel together with Theo Araujo, Jessica Petrovsky, and Claes de Fraser, who are all here and all from the University of Amsterdam. The title of the panel is Open Science Meets Digital Methods, Match Made in Heaven or Mutually Exclusive. And each of our panelists has already given a presentation individually that they have uploaded to the virtual space and that we advise you to watch before you actually now listen to this discussion, so you are fully informed and aware of what everyone is talking about. And we have a great discussion for this panel, and this is Benjamin Johnson from the University of Florida. I skipped introducing everyone else because we just lose time, and I guess this is possible to see on the platform. And without any further ado, I hand this over to Ben, and happy that you took on this task.
Absolutely, and thank you, Jakob, for co-chairing and organizing this session. So I guess I had two thoughts when I first learned about this panel. One was, putting these two topics together is really exciting, open science and digital research, working with trace data. And then I guess I had a more naive thought, which was mutually exclusive. Of course not. Of course they're compatible. But I think that was naive because then when I sort of really engaged with what these researchers were doing in their presentations, they all had very, I think, nuanced, sophisticated analyses of the balances. There are a lot of trade-offs here. So, I wouldn't say that these things are mutually exclusive, but there's a lot to negotiate, and there's still a lot that we don't know about how we can engage in open practices while working with digital tools. So they were all fantastic presentations. It's all, I think, really relevant work for the theme and for ICA in general. A couple sort of threads that came through the different presentations that I wanted to point out. First of all, we often lament how difficult it is to get data from big digital platforms, from Facebook or Instagram, for example. It can be quite difficult to get that rich, detailed data that we want from them. But then there's sort of maybe it's ironic, once we get it ourselves or once we're able to get it ourselves, then it becomes quite hard to share with others. So we want that data, we want it to be shared with us, but then there are all sorts of logistical, practical, ethical issues in terms of making that data open in the way we might make survey or experimental data open and shared with others. Another common theme that tied, I think, all of these pieces together is the importance of accounting for selection bias. So if we're engaging in data donation processes or asking people to track or let us track their online footprint, who is opting in, who's opting out, and how do we account for those biases? And then the third theme that really tied everything together was, how do we balance these open principles, wanting to be rigorous, robust, transparent in our research with the really big needs for privacy, doing this kind of digital trace research, the needs to engage in exploration. This type of research lends itself to exploration, but often requires exploration. And then just how do we navigate the sheer amount of resources involved with digital observation data, and how can we balance that with open science principles? So I guess I'll go through the presentations in the order of the program, and I have, I think, questions for each team of presenters or each presenter, so we can definitely have a back and forth if the authors would like to. So I'll start with Mario's presentation, Chaim, Steyer, and Brouwer. So I really liked how they began talking about fragmentation in two ways. We have fragmentation of content, but we have fragmentation of use. And if we acknowledge those realities, it really kind of shines a light on how limited a lot of our existing methods are. And I do like the characterization they have of, traditional methods sometimes as being broad and slow, when what we want is something that's specific and fast. if we want to study fragmentation. So their solution was to combine 3 different sources of data, and I thought this was really great. Panel survey data along with web tracking of second-level domains, and then tracking exposure to public Facebook posts with a plugin. And so by focusing on public Facebook posts, by focusing on second-level domains, they were able to balance privacy with openness, so not getting excessively fine-grained in terms of what they were tracking, so that there's possibility to share this data or to be open in their methods. And I think they point out, well, one of the strengths of their approach and one of the challenges in this area is how do we combine data? How do we integrate data from different sources? That's important for the work, but it also immediately presents privacy and ethical issues. One question I guess I had for Mario and the team is, talked about the additional incentives that they offered. So as people opted into more level of sharing, adding a plugin, being willing to turn on web tracking, what were the incentives, or was there concern about introducing selection bias there? In the if the incentive is too large, would that entice certain people to be more likely to trade off their privacy? So I was curious. Yeah. If you don't mind, I think we can do it fairly interactively. How did you all approach this idea of self-selection and accounting for that bias?
So in very thanks, Ben. First of all, in very technical terms, first we offered them more money essentially. So they got it's a point system on that provider's platform, and they get points for participating in the survey, and they got more points if they were willing to also share other levels of data with us. We found that to be let me put it in words. We didn't like the idea very much, but we tried in a separate study that I didn't present first without providing any incentives, and we had huge problems getting anybody to basically participate, which is why we started that. We had a couple of remarks by potential participants that they had to drop out for technical reasons. So they were, for example, using Safari browsers that we were not able to suffice basically, and they were thus not able to get additional incentives. So there was also this kind of bias in that sense. That's I would say another level of kind of keeping in mind how to exclude people and also how to affect the self-selection that you initially introduced. So we thought it was a problem, but we found it to be essential to get at least a basic number of participants.
Thanks. And I was wondering, for the web tracking, was that another plugin, or was that something that was done by the survey panel company? How did you exactly do the web tracking?
That was with a survey company. So they have people in their panel of web tracking, and they then contacted these people with our survey and asked them if they were willing to share their web tracking also with our survey.
Okay, because I was wondering, having to add multiple plugins or something, but they just had to do the one plugin for Facebook. Okay. I really love that you all did dynamic tracking. I think that's so important to look at processes over time, and looking at, does exposure to a potential exposure to a link on Facebook lead to, visiting that URL. That was really fascinating how you looked at the different windows of opportunity. As you acknowledge in the presentation, that's tough to do. It's tough to know whether they actually went to that URL, to that domain via Facebook, or whether they accessed it later through some other means. And I think even if they access it through Facebook, that might, even the time frame might vary. People might immediately click, or people might circle back later, open a tab. There's all kinds of variation built in. So I was wondering if you had all thought about how you might build on that work and try to validate, what percentage of these URL visits are coming from Facebook, or what does that variation look like, and how long it takes someone to make a visit.
We We did before and after conducting the study. So the thoughts we had before were basically in the realm of what you mentioned before, as balancing out open science principles versus privacy. So we could also try to track everything through the browser plugin and would know whether people clicked and then landed on the other web. So we did not do that for privacy reasons. So afterwards, we had to kind of check whether the assumptions that we made, the window, the dynamic window, matched what we thought it would match. And what we did is we asked people to estimate several at several levels. So we asked them to estimate how many of their posts they see on Facebook are coming from news sources, for example, and then match that with what we knew from the tracking in order to get an estimate.
Okay.
We asked them to on how many of these they clicked usually, and try to kind of get an estimate for that. Although I have to say that this is based on rather limited numbers, because as I showed in the presentation, we only matched so many of these couplings, and then asking these people to kind of put that into a dimension that they remember kind of resembles what we had with the original surveys anyhow. This can you remember the last time you watched a news show, or can you?
Then it's right back to the original problem.
Kind of like a chicken and egg problem.
That's good, and I really appreciated the discussions you all had in terms of risk. I was wondering what happens if the participant leaves the plugin installed. Does it keep sending data to your server, or do you instruct them to uninstall it at some point, or how that works?
Yeah, we instructed them to uninstall that at some point.
Okay.
But it keeps sending until they uninstall it.
Okay. And then I guess the last question I had for Mario was, you were, I think, skeptical about the possibility, even with a lot of the careful balancing that you did to get this approved by ethical boards as a procedure. Curious if that skepticism is grounded in your experience with a board. Did you get pushback, or how much have you tried to push back on the board to allow something like this?
We contacted 2 boards and asked what their suggestion was to move forward with this project, and both of them were like, we should look at what? We cannot look at code. We cannot try to put us in that perspective, and we can also not give you approval for this software that we don't know really what it does. So they did not see any reasonable scenario in which they could give us approval for such a scenario.
Really, wow. I feel like that's a bit strict, but yeah. So I think what you all are doing is really important. So thinking about, I guess, ways to make it approvable would be an important step. But I think it's great work, and I really appreciated it. To kind of make a transition, 2 points that go ahead, Jakob.
We have to speed up a bit. So if we could move to the next paper and also restrict the number of questions, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. So the next piece is Young-Mi. I thought this was really exciting. Also talking about competing values on the digital data side, digital research side, individual focus. It's typically private, often exploratory, this type of work. In contrast to open science, where some of the principles are, science is a public good, science should be public facing, and there's an emphasis on confirmatory research. So I guess wanted to know a little bit more about this eScope program that you've developed, Young-Mi, and how that, it looks like maybe that was done in collaboration or in consultation with your institution's ethics board.
Yes, so we developed this ad tracking app, like named eScope, election scope. So this one is basically worked like an ad blocker, but instead of blocking the ads, it automatically detected ads by using some heuristics in the code, add the script, and then the code, like sort of with the backend code. And then capture the content, like a text and images, and then that information such as landing page, where this ad lead us if we click the ad, which indicate the sources. and a timestamp and the sponsors and the like. So by using this tracking method, we aim to increase the transparency, because like ads data, at least like back in 2016 when we started this project, ads data is proprietary and was not available and not accessible, and the tech platforms like just had the entire ownership. So we used this like user-based like a tracking, so it did not interact with the tech platforms server. So we did not have any legal issues with the tech platforms. But because this is a user-based app, it has to be informed consent, and it actually took us about 4 or 5 months to get an approval from the IRB.
Okay.
And then we shared all the data server, database encryption procedure, and the database architecture. And we shared everything, I guess, what's happening at the back end, and then we shared the demo, and then IRB members used the tracking tool for a few days. Yeah, things like that.
That's a nice approach.
And then like we combined all these like users of the eScope filled out the survey, which include demographics and then things like that at the time of installation. So, and then we had like a screening questions on like a basic demographics and photo registration, things like that, whether they register to vote or not, before they are recruited for the participation. So by doing that way, we could meter the sample representativeness, like they meter the U.S. voting age population. But at the same time, like about like a selection bias, we can see who consented to participate to use eScope versus not, and then see if there are any systematic biases in terms of the key demographic variables.
Yeah, I appreciated that you addressed selection bias and didn't see a lot in terms of demographics in the project. One question I had, or one point I wanted to make was, I really liked how you pointed out all the different points in the consent form where you're addressing the privacy issues and the open issues, because rethinking the consent process I think is important for open science. And I noticed that it said data access is strictly limited to researchers in the team, so you couldn't even share data with other people on request. So I think that it's quite stringent, and kind of like with Mario's team, like how much can we push back on IRBs, because we want to engage in more openness with our research. So
absolutely, that's something I want all of us as communication research community to think about, because I actually didn't think about the consent form pretty much follow the conventional IRB, like a human subject, like a protection policies and principles. And I didn't, it was like a 2014 and 2015 when we first developed this project. So I didn't really think about like open science principles, to be honest with you. And then later, when we tried to publish the data, a lot of like high impact journals required the data sharing. Then like we ran into this problem. So my suggestion for us is that we have to plan ahead, like keeping in mind that like we are moving toward the open science practices. So we need to really think deep and then think through, what we need to do and what kind of information we should include in informed consent processes.
Yeah, that's great. And I also like another aspect of openness in this project was it's bringing transparency and trying to shine light on communication practices that are often opaque. So, dark content or coordinated sponsorship campaigns. So I was thinking about, does that fit under open science practices in terms of trying to like liberate data, or is this something else that's maybe more about, sunshine laws, and maybe it comes from more of a journalist perspective? But I think that's an interesting question in terms of, what does openness mean for trying to open up
exactly.
proprietary data?
Right, that's an excellent question, and I think that's like an open question we should have, because if we think about IRB principles, it's all based on experimental study and then individual level analysis. But some of our analysis or group level, you just mentioned the sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
One of our research goal is to increase the transparency by looking at covert coordination among like unknown actors, including foreign actors. Like the foreign actor part, like election interference was discovery. I did not expect to see that, but because of that, I found that the IRB rules are very fuzzy. So it was, I could claim that for public benefit, I'm actually following the transparency rules. So lots of leave the data, but there are so many legal issues or legal ramifications to think about. So frankly speaking, we just decide not to engage legal issues deeply, but instead share the data in a processed interpretive forms for reproducibility. So, and that requires a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, I guess one more point I'll make about this project. I really like some of your takeaways in terms of.
Should we move
on?
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's all right. And we can chat in the comments too. So I'll talk about the Thorsten, Pak, and colleagues. So this is trying to understand the sorting algorithms that exist on social media. Those algorithms are consequential, but they're also opaque. And so this is a comparison of donors and non-donors. So just like the fourth presentation, looking at data donors, addressing that issue in terms of, are donors different from non-donors, and then also doing some exciting work to tackle data sparsity. So rare occurrences of variables of interest, like following a particular news channel. So I thought in terms of the comparisons of donors and non-donors, it was really fascinating that, the top of that graph, that the intensive Facebook users, the very reliant Facebook users, were less likely to donate their data. So I wondered how much that was connected to maybe they felt like they were doing more on Facebook, they had more personal information there because they were intensive users. And so they had, they stood to lose more if they shared their data. And then I thought I really loved the way you all presented the correlations. So, showing that the donors have those weaker correlations, or in some cases flipped correlations compared to the full sample. The weighting approaches I thought were really exciting. Some of the possibilities there. The propensity, I think it's the propensity weighting, didn't provide estimates close to the full sample. So I was wondering, Kirsten, if you thought that, in the absence of machine learning or econometric modeling, would you all recommend using demographics as weights as opposed to the IPW solution?
So thank you, and hi everybody. I think the big takeaway from our whole presentation is a real sense of paralysis, actually, because we thought that the problem of the difference between the donators and the non-donators, that we could use some sort of a demographic weighting and that we would be comfortable with what we find. But then as we start to run the analyses that are sort of core to the questions that we ask, as you saw, they're fairly different when we just look at demographics. And actually the demographics don't seem to be what really differentiate the donators and the non-donators. It's some of these other variables that are, of course, variables of interest that are really important to us. And so, CK, couldn't be here, but CK Pak has really been doing the deep dives, the deep analysis dives. And I think we keep coming back for air and saying, well, what's our rule of thumb, right? Where are we going to be comfortable with saying, we know what these differences are, and we're able to account for them in the relationships that we see there. And I think that's been really, really holding up this process for us, is because there is no real clear guidance as to where we're going to be comfortable with which of these many procedures that we're experimenting with actually produces an outcome that we're comfortable with in terms of understanding.
Okay. And then in terms of the data sparsity, so you had priors for some keywords, like words that were already in the Nominate database, but not others. I was wondering if you all had a sense of like what percentage of the keywords you did have priors for, how many were sort of novel?
I'm sorry, that's a secret question, because
Okay.
I actually don't know about that. And part of what we've been wrestling with that piece of the analysis, and I don't mean to get too in the weeds for everybody who hasn't seen it yet, but is really trying to understand to what extent is there really a relationship between the partisanship of the things that you're tagged as being interested in by Facebook and your actual self-reported partisanship. So everything we know, right, of the empirical work on partisan filter bubbles suggests that they aren't really that prevalent, and that is what we see in the data. That really trying to sort people out by what they've been tagged as interested in isn't clean in terms of the relationship to partisanship. And I think to Young Me's project as well, part of that is because what we know about how the advertising classification system works is that oftentimes you become classified with something after you've been advertised to. And so therefore it might be about who you're being targeted, how you're being targeted, rather than just a reflection of what your actual interests are. And so there's this sort of causality issue in there that's hard for us to untangle.
And then lastly, you all said that you are thinking about how to make these materials and methods open source. So what are some of the challenges or opportunities you're seeing there in terms of taking what you've been developing and making it open, making it shareable?
So for we had, this is the third time we've done this data collection, and so for the paper that's published on the earlier rounds of data, all of the dictionaries that we use to sort of classify and capture everything and clean the data are out there. But what we promise our participants is that we don't use the raw data of everything that you're interested in. Instead, we take your data out and attach it to this gigantic dictionary of political terms and news terms and all of this different stuff. And so actually to the presentation that I think we'll talk about next, we're pulling out the sort of aggregated data in the first place. And so I think we feel pretty comfortable with that, but we lose a lot of information that way as well. And I think a lot of us are experiencing that same sort of tension, which is, the ways in which we protect privacy also then down the road prevent us from answering some sort of question. So I think CK's dream, and he's not here to describe it, would be that once we feel comfortable having solved some of these problems, solved at least in the short term, that those methods could also be shareable as well. Because I think it's really important that we look across these projects and see do these, like, I don't know how many of you are having to incentivize men to donate their data. We've had a lot more trouble getting men to donate their data than women. I think there's a lot of things that we're going to see happening consistently once we start to surface all these sort of the micro level challenges.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. That's a great transition to the fourth presentation from Jeff, Daniel, and Teo. So this is also about data donation, and I think they've developed a really nice approach to this. Jeff, I like the way you began by talking about the different approaches to digital data collection and making a little bit of a distinction or dichotomy between cooperative approaches, like social science 1, and then adversarial approaches. And so I think the idea here with what you're doing is to exploit the data subject's rights via the GDPR to access their data and donate it. So I guess a question I had was when the participants or when the end user is getting their data, how fine-grained can that get? Because I know, like, for example, Facebook properties, you can download data about yourself and it might have information about like ad keywords and targeting. What more can they get by invoking their GDPR rights?
So hi, and thanks for the questions and for having me on the panel. And indeed, let me start by a disclaimer that I'm a lawyer, and I still feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland sometimes in this communication science field. So see this as an apology if I, in my answers, say something ignorant of the communication science field. But so indeed, like the idea behind our presentation was really to sort of reverse a bit that paradigm of data protection and privacy law, looking at it as sort of a huge obstacle to doing research, and use it actually as a tool. And so to get to your question, in the last couple of years, especially since this GDPR has entered into force, now also, of course, in California, we have a Privacy Act, including a similar access right. Doesn't go that far as a GDPR, but still. You see a lot more companies progressively installing these data download tools to sort of preempt their legal obligations. So from what I've seen so far, many of these tools are a nice first step, but generally they do not offer all of the data that you have access to legally, right? And this is sort of an ongoing battle that will hopefully improve over time as these companies are more and more pushed to give all of the data that individuals have a right to get access to. I think with Facebook in particular, I mean, it's been a while since I've used the tool myself, but as far as I know, some things that are not included in the tool are the tracking data, browser. So basically, all of the all of the social plugin tracking data.
Okay.
Which is a potentially big one, you know, if you want to use this type of data. Another issue there is interoperability. Often, I've heard more technically adept people say that these platforms often change the format in which they provide data, which also makes it hard to do longitudinal studies and compare stuff.
Okay,
I don't know if Theo maybe wants to add something more methodological there or not.
Well, I think maybe something to consider more from a more generic perspective is that a lot of the things that we're seeing in terms of data downloads being available now are at least partially due to the GDPR law and to these discussions in Europe. So a lot of the things that platforms are adding, and probably even for a whole world, are coming from these rights that people have to access their own data. So one of the things that are even some strategies in terms of, because indeed it's not complete, and there's a lot of things that are not as fine-grained as we would want as citizens or as researchers, but there's an opportunity maybe to partner up with lawyers like Jeff to actually try to force some of these platforms or companies to actually give the data in ways that we would actually like, or that we would actually think that as citizens we might have a right to.
And Theo, when participants use that MIFI tool to share their data with you, do they have some fine-grained control over what they're sharing? So are they making choices about what gets shared with the researchers?
Yeah, so I think...
Or is it like a yes or no?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one, because that's coming actually from Daniel, even from a methodological perspective, with the whole idea that we don't see, or this is still being piloted, right? But the whole idea is that the researcher doesn't see the data from the participants. So all the calculations in terms of, for example, political interest or media exposure or whatever it is, would be done locally in the participant's own computer. And only the scores would be uploaded after the participant also reviews the scores.
Yeah.
As a communication scientist, I have a bit of mixed feelings about it, because I really want to see the raw data and I want to see kind of explore things. But from a privacy protection perspective, and even from a methodological perspective, after it's validated, I think it's a very important step to actually even be more transparent towards the participants themselves.
Well, thank you. And I think this is a great contribution and a useful way to think about and managing data donation. So these are all great presentations. Thank you all for sharing your work. I don't think open science and digital research are mutually exclusive, but it's going to take some work to balance these things out. I'll turn it back over to Jakob.
Yeah, there were I think very good closing words. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for all the great contributions and answers to the questions. I think we leave it with this, but I hope that every participant of ICA that watches this joins us in the comment section, post questions. We will be available in different time zones, so you might even get responses around the clock. And yeah, please watch the full presentations by all of our panelists. And with that, have a good virtual ICA wherever you may watch this. Bye-bye.